Thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled Rethinking and Recentering the Celebration of American Women's History. Our leader for this session is Emily Krichbaum, Assistant Director of Strategic Programs and Education at the National Women's History Museum. We also have Elizabeth Ault and Angela Lee, who will serve as our teacher advisors for this evening. Again, thank you all for joining us, and we're looking forward to another engaging, immersive, and dare I say, fun evening ahead. Okay, Emily Krichbaum is a historian of American women. She earned her MA and PhD from Case Western Reserve University, where she studied modern American social movements. Her dissertation, which received the Jane and Cecil Lyman Prize for Best PhD Dissertation and was recently featured by the Smithsonian's flagship podcast, Side Door, explores the intersection of feminism, ageism, and advocacy through the lives of Maggie Kuhn and Tish Summers. She spent the first 10 years of her academic career teaching American history and American women's history at the undergraduate and graduate level, leading professional development on primary source-centered classrooms across the nation and establishing intergenerational female mentoring and leadership programming for female students and faculty. She is the recipient of several university-wide teaching and mentoring awards. In 2018, Krichbaum founded Remember the Ladies, an initiative to incorporate more women's history in American history classrooms, equipping teachers and school districts to provide more representative and inclusive histories, because you can't be what you don't see. Since its inception, she has worked with 50-plus school districts around the country. After leaving the university, she taught and founded a leadership center at an all-girls independent school, where she developed programming and curriculum to ensure the next generation of female leaders have the tools to lead themselves and others. Currently, she serves as the Assistant Director of Strategic Programs and Education at the National Women's History Museum, where she leads and oversees a range of innovative educational programs and strategic initiatives while collaborating with external partners to create impactful programs and exhibitions. She is also a lecturer at The Ohio State University and a lead facilitator for Lean In Girls. To our teachers who have so patiently waited for this evening, and to everyone who's now joining us, I present to you our speaker for this evening, Emily Krichbaum. Emily, we look forward to your talk. Thank you for joining us. I hope all is well.
Thank you so much, Mike, for having me, to the National Humanities Center, to the amazing teachers on the Teachers Advisory Council, and to all the educators who are currently joining us. Your patience, we appreciate you. Technology is great until it isn't. Having been someone who has, I would say, served is a good verb, in the classroom, you do the absolute most important and exhausting work. And the fact that you are online after hours to learn more just shows your dedication to the craft, and more importantly, to your students. And so I wanted to start by simply thanking you for taking Women's History Month incredibly seriously. Slide's a little messed up here, but the recentering and rethinking of the celebration of Women's History Month. Again, my name is Emily Krichbaum, and I am the one in the picture with color, surrounded by some of the most remarkable girls and women in American history. While we celebrate the trailblazers and the torchbearers, I think it's also incredibly important that we remember that women make history every single day, as the National Women's History Museum likes to say. Just a little bit about the museum. We were founded in 1996, and we believe in using women's history as a vehicle to push gender parity, as we are currently over 100 years from achieving that. We elevate the voices and stories of those not regularly heard in American history classrooms, and do so by acknowledging the historical context in which these women lived, including the barriers that they faced, their quotidian experiences with challenging and pushing gender roles, and also the voices that are heard even less, oftentimes pushed out by white women within the movement. Just a few individuals, some we will talk about today, some we will not, but Ruby Bridges in the top left, Amelia Earhart on the bottom left. In the middle, we have Althea Gibson. To the right of her, we have Vera Rubin. And to the right of myself, the first Black Congresswoman, Shirley Chisholm, the closest, sadly, I will ever get to that magnificent woman. Today, we're going to look at the importance of women's history first and foremost, the ways in which we get women's history wrong in the way that we cover it and the way that we celebrate it. And once I'm done talking about the ways in which we do it incorrectly, including myself, I'll provide some examples and calls to action of ways that we can take this issue and this topic very seriously, because that's exactly what it is. And so first and foremost, why teach American women's history? I'm glad we have 6 hours in this webinar to cover this topic. I'm kidding. Don't worry, Mike. I'll be as brief, but yet as thorough as possible. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version, and then I will give you the Charles Dickens, I'm pretending I get paid by the word edition. The Cliff Notes version is that women made history, and that's why you should teach it. And when you include women into the narrative of American history, it actually changes the story. This isn't about women's historians playing a historical Where's Waldo, or maybe Where's Walda, and simply saying, oh, there's one, there's another, I see one. But women have played a significant part in every step of American history, in every American war even, from deputy husbands and nursing and sanitary commissions, to soldier spies and code breaking, to discoveries and inventions that have not only improved our lives, but saved millions of lives. This is why we tell these stories. Now, Charles Dickens is entering into the chat. Women's history education is also a cornerstone for achieving gender parity in the United States. When we teach and learn about women's contributions, about women's struggles, and about women's triumphs, we illuminate the pathways that they've carved throughout history, often in the face of systemic barriers. This knowledge not only inspires individuals of all genders to value women's roles in shaping society, but it also fosters a deeper understanding of the structural inequities that persist today. And so by integrating women's history into American history education, we challenge stereotypes, we dismantle biases, we empower future generations to envision a world where opportunities can truly be equitable. When young people learn about trailblazing women in STEM or in government or in the arts and beyond, they see the possibilities for their own lives. Closing the gender parity gap isn't just a matter of fairness. It's an investment in the collective future, because women's history education equips us with the tools to build a more just, innovative, and collaborative society where gender is not a barrier, but a celebrated dimension of human potential. And so stories are a tool. They can empower or disempower. They shape the way we see ourselves and our potential. And it really begins, this disempowerment or empowerment, with the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And that's why we need to set the record straight. Doing so will not only push back and correct incomplete historical narratives, but it will also identify gaps they find as they work towards finding these truths. And so if students can't see themselves reflected in history books, it's imperative that they understand that it's the recounting of history that is wrong, not their identity. And so oftentimes I hear the question, what is there to teach? All that women really did, this is primarily, domesticity. And I don't know if we necessarily need to know about the history of feminine products or, kitchen stoves. And of course, there is so much more to that, and I will tell stories of women tonight that are. But it is incredibly challenging to locate primary sources and to be able to rescue these individuals from uh, the forgotten pages of history. And that's one of the reasons why the National Women's History Museum, the New York Historical Society, WAMS, Women I'm not sure WAMS, there's a women's center at the New York Historical Society that also has wonderful resources, but their specific acronym is eluding me at the moment. That is one of the reasons why it's so important to leverage these types of resources, because it isn't the first story that you will read or that you will hear, but it's oftentimes one of the most impactful. And so, where are they? And why do we not know about them? As an aside, in the background is quotes from the very famous TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. One of the reasons why we don't know about them is because in the earliest years, many women didn't have the education to be able to collect and create their own stories. In fact, that is one of the greatest initiatives today is if we are going to have women's history, we need to retain the records of women. We need to make sure that, for example, 5 years ago, the museum started a rapid collection of women's stories during COVID. And we have and will be commemorating the 5-year event of 700 entries from women around the United States sharing how this was a specifically unique experience for them, whether that was as someone who was caring for children or working from home and caring for children, or needing to be the caretaker of their parents and their children, all of these different things. It's important that we first and foremost retain the stories that we currently have and are experiencing, and also looking back to try and discover the ones that women have been attempting to tell throughout history. But ultimately, a lot of women's work wasn't considered to be important. The only reason why we know that women were some of the leading medical experts in colonial times was because of a book by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who rescued a journal of a midwife from Maine and talked about the ways in which she cared for an entire community, like other midwives in the area. And medicine didn't become an almost exclusively male occupation until it became professionalized and lucrative. But those keeping historical records rarely included women because, again, it was assumed that women contributed little in the form of official or political change. And there were, of course, barriers. I mean, literal barriers, figurative barriers. If you look at women in STEM, for example, women have always been a part of science and technology and engineering and math, but they've faced significant barriers to their participation along the way. They weren't allowed to publish scientific papers. They were expected to grow up exclusively to become good wives and mothers, and the majority of chemistry should have to deal with their casseroles. Many people thought that women were simply not as smart as men. And one of the most recent quotes that I had read was just 20 years old from the then Harvard president, who said that he believed that women's brains were actually inferior, that they lacked a certain intrinsic aptitude. And so the women that we're going to be featuring today had to break down some stereotypes, obviously, to have many of the careers that they wanted. And they broke rules by publishing under pseudonyms and working for the love of learning alone. One of these examples comes from Dr. Anna Searcy. And Dr. Searcy, pictured here, you can see as the only woman. There's actually a fantastic book by a woman who was primarily doing documentaries and started to find these photographs of just one woman and would find the history behind these photographs. And so Dr. Anna Searcy appears with her hat, her first year classmates, professors, and Mr. Bones, as he was identified in the yearbook at the University of Missouri School of Medicine. She definitely looks like the odd man out among the bareheaded men in their starched collars. She wears that loopy zigzag of a hat, like a manic thought bubble, and a facial expression that's just as memorable. The caption identified her as, quote, class secretary. And it was only recently that was recognized that she, in fact, was the first woman to enter the school and graduate as a doctor. But it was likely that some of her classmates thought it would be funny to write class secretary as opposed to acknowledge her as a student. And so it wasn't until the sleuthing that was done in recent years by Dr. Elizabeth Garrett, who embarked on a quest to learn the life stories of her alma mater's first women graduates. This woman, Dr. Searcy, would end up practicing medicine until she was 94. As she said that she had no reason to retire, she just told her patients to knock a little louder. Dr. Garrett found that Searcy had been an orphan who was sent to college by a charity fund. The young woman had believed that her lucky break was the answer to years of fervent prayer. She was already in her 30s by the time that she entered medical school. And it was absolutely demanding. Of that class of 25, almost entirely of men, she was one of only 4 to graduate. She went on to a small town practice, was noted for her generous support of a charitable education fund. And the Missouri Medical School in 2018 initiated a special award in Searcy's name. The first winner was Dr. Garrett, and the design of the award, this is great, itself is an abstract homage to Anna Searcy's hat in this picture. And so a lot of times, even though women do end up in these photographs, even then, the history can be somewhat erased, even by a joke such as class secretary. I'm not sure what's going on with these slides. Elizabeth Freeman, Mom Bet, I'll go to the next slide here. In 1780, as the United States fought for their independence from Great Britain, Massachusetts had created their own state constitution. Now, in fact, the beginning of the Massachusetts Constitution was inspired by the Declaration of Independence, with its words that all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights. As was custom for the time, important documents like the newly written Constitution would be read in towns throughout the state, and many would attend because obviously this is pretty important information. And, well, they didn't have White Lotus or The Bear or Stranger Things to watch. I digress. In one town, an enslaved woman by the name of Mom Bet overheard a man reading this new Constitution with the words that all men are born free and equal. Free and equal. After hearing this, Mom Bet decided she would take her master to court and sue for her freedom. Her and her lawyer argued that her enslavement under the new Massachusetts government was unconstitutional, and she won. And she won. She gave herself a new name, a freedom name, of Elizabeth Freeman. Her case marked the beginning of a long line of what would be called freedom suits, where enslaved men and women were fighting for their freedom in the Massachusetts courts until the courts finally decided to declare the institution unconstitutional entirely. This Brom and Betts v. Ashley was cited as a precedent for the Quock Walker freedom suit, which led to the declaring of the institution unconstitutional. And so if we can talk about Quock Walker, we should be able to also acknowledge Elizabeth Freeman. There may not be time to talk about a Dr. Anna Searcy who was kidded into history believing that she was class secretary, or to fellow colleagues who, while they got into medical school, would regularly have pickets in front of their homes and organs thrown at them during anatomy class. But everyone should know about Elizabeth Freeman. Elizabeth Freeman's was one of the first stories, and this story matters, but it will only matter if young girls hear about it. It has been said by various scholars that women still only comprise less than 1% of over 3,500 years of written history, 0.5%. And as of 2017, state social studies standards oblige K-12 public schools to cover hundreds of historical figures, 559 of them being men and 178 women. About one woman for every 3 men. Now, what's wild about this is of those women that are being discussed, you'll see a breakdown here. Almost 60% of the women that are discussed in state social studies standards. Now, of course, this is not updated. This is 2017, but we are working on a new study to update the findings that should be released in 2027. So almost 60% are viewed as domestic, as support, as the partner, and then 2% of women that are supposed to be studied are seen in the workforce, or in progressive movements, or in civil rights, because we all know that we can't teach women's history or American history without Rosa Parks. That is the one that will always remain. And the first and second wave feminist movement or suffrage, it's very limited. So when that less than 10% of American history taught in the classrooms is focused on women in domestic roles as a supportive partner, cooking, cleaning, rearing children, and taking care of the home, what young students are left with are textbooks that tell stories about men's decisions and autonomy and leadership and courage and vision and women's domesticity and those few moments where they fought for equality and won. Of these state standards as well, 2 of the individuals that are highlighted as required to be taught in the majority of these states weren't even real human beings. They're fictional. Rosie the Riveter on the left, Molly Pitcher on the right. Now, some of you who know your women's history might say, well, they represented women. You know, Rosie represented hundreds of women that that worked in factories during wartime. Well, then give me their names. We're making up names for people who had actual lived experiences. And so what does it mean when you have this one-dimensional caricature as opposed to knowing the stories about women who wrote to their husbands overseas during the war and saying, I love this life, and having money to spend of my own and managing a budget and getting a raise and getting to know people outside of this house. And Frank, do you think you can ever live with me again if I continue to work? Will you still love me? Right? Those are the things that we need to be sharing, because that is what brings humanity to the forefront and also acknowledges the struggles that women went through. And the facts are that women didn't just make homes, they made history. And it's important that we tell these stories. I think that this The reason why some of these slides look a little mangled is because I tried to be fancy in doing some of this on Canva. And there are great problems when a Luddite scholar like myself attempts to have a little parlay with technology. But again, you will see some quotes from The Danger of a Single Story by the lovely scholar and novelist Chimamanda Adichie. And she says in her talk, show a people as only one thing over and over again, and that is what they become. The consequence of the single story is that it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult, and it emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. And so again, I think Women's History Month, Women's History, it's so important to think about the stories in which your students and the young girls in your life will hear when they come in contact with you, when they interact with the things that you are teaching, and what perception of themselves could they potentially leave with after your stories. And I do encourage you to do this not just for girls, but young boys need to hear these stories too. They need to see what women are capable of doing and to not assume that it's a far-fetched idea that women could be in the highest levels of governments, of businesses, etc. And I'd like you to not just do this in March or on Women's Wednesdays or for a special assembly, because what is regularly taught in the classroom and held as important matters. This term here says symbolic annihilation. There's been a great amount of research done that suggests that if you don't see people like you in the information you consume, from what you study in schools to the television shows that you watch, you assume that you are unimportant and somehow less capable. And that term is called symbolic annihilation. In other words, you can't be what you don't see, or in other words, if you don't see the potential in yourself either. Now, to be clear, we are not changing the history of America. We are simply expanding the lens. Today, we have amazing examples of courage, of persistence, of leadership, from the previous Prime Minister of New Zealand to the ways in which Simone Biles advocated for herself, to the ways that Greta Thunberg has stood up against political leaders and called out for great change with global warming. But what young girls need to know is that not only do these women exist, but that this is nothing new. These characteristics have always been a part of their lineage, and it will always be a part of their legacy. Another term, something that Miranda Fricker has coined in her book, Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing, suggests that this type of injustice, and this goes beyond simply women's history, this goes to many different histories, this type of injustice is a wrong done to someone in their capacity as a knower. In other words, injustice occurs when a gap in collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their social experiences. Injustice occurs when a gap in collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their social experiences. And so we see and hear about very few women in our American history classrooms, and when we do, it's in a very incomplete, which then becomes an inaccurate light. And we're left with wondering about our legacy and our history. I'd like to pause here. I'm wondering if there might be some questions.
Thank you so much. And I encourage everyone, if you should have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A chat box, and I will bring them to Emily's attention at the appropriate time. Um, there was a question early on from Riley, and I believe you're going to cover this as we continue on, and you've covered it a little bit thus far. But the question is thoughts on how to offer opinions about women empowerment in high school classes without blatantly giving your opinion. How do you walk that line, or recommendations for balancing discussions, instructional approaches focused on women's empowerment, but doing so in a way without giving your opinion?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I don't, I think the idea of giving your opinion on if girls in your classroom matter, I'm not sure and I know that wasn't the question, but I think everyone should be able to boldly state that every individual in their classroom matters and is seen. What I have greatly appreciated about my experience working in a K through 12 or a pre-K through 12 all girls school is understanding the ways in which girls are shaped by our culture and by society, and that there are specific ways in which to approach young women and to encourage them in their studies. So, for example, young women, and I'm speaking in broad strokes because everyone is different, but for the most part, young women will always be seeking your approval. They always want to make sure that they are doing it right, that they don't mess up, and that it becomes personal for them. And so, for example, when you give feedback on papers, I would recommend that you don't use the "I found this" or "I thought this." It's not about you. It's direct feedback to them, and your feedback to them and your grade to them is not in any direct relation to how you feel about them as a human being. There's a great book out there right now called Never Enough, and it's about this mattering movement, and how often, whether it's boys or girls, that we talk to young people, and the main conversations that we have with them are based in accomplishment. How did the game go? How did the test go? How did you get into that college? What are you going to do for a living? What do you want to major in? That's exhausting and that's incredibly stressful, right? What would it mean? One of the suggestions is the puppy dog effect. What would it mean if you were just excited to see them? All right, hard stop. And there weren't necessarily questions about what they've accomplished, but instead what they're currently interested in, what they like. I did something as simple as forward an email to a student when I was teaching because she had presented on inflation in AP Gov and was just wildly fascinated with inflation before inflation was what it is now. And I forwarded her something about, I don't know, it must have been a finance camp or something. I think you would be great at this. I think you would be interested in this. And she felt seen, and she started a team for a competition for a national personal finance challenge, and then ended up doing the UPenn Wall Street Stock Exchange competition. I think so much of it is not necessarily stop, rewind, stop, play. I think the way that you celebrate girls and young women is not solely in the teaching of women's history, but it's in magnifying their potential that you see in them. Because so often they are either A, not able to see it in themselves quite yet. Because remember, a girl's confidence peaks in the 5th grade and will not recover until they are 40. So a lot of Women's History Month and the celebrations of Women's History Month can be highlighting those that are right in front of us and being a mirror to the strengths that we see, to helping them be able to say in a complete sentence what their strengths are, and being able and encouraging them to talk about themselves and their strengths. If you see an individual who's rather introverted but interested in the law, maybe you would share with her an example from Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life and how she too got exhausted by crowds and would rather be with her books, and because of that helped push for great gender parity in the United States. If you have an avid swimmer that you know, you could send her to learn more about the 64-year-old woman who swam 90 miles from Cuba to the United States without a shark cage and was the first individual to ever do so, and it was her sixth attempt. I digress. I don't think that women's history is a political or an activist or advocate mode. Women's history is American history. Elizabeth Freeman fought for freedom long before Quock Walker. It's just teaching history, I think is what I'd say. But that's not the only way that you can encourage young women. I'd also suggest the International Coalition for Girls' Schools podcasts that regularly discuss the ways in which that you can highlight and center women within your classroom to their betterment for leadership skills. And when they apologize before they even begin speaking, call them out on that, right? When they're trying to get the A+++ and they're rewriting their notes 12 times because it makes them feel better and somehow proves and brands them as a really good student, tell them to think smarter and not harder. The majority of boys, research shows, will try and find the easiest way to an A, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. So those are my thoughts. Those are a lot of thoughts. I could have more, but I also acknowledge that this is not the 6-hour webinar that I wished it could be, Mike. Maybe this will be a 1 in a 6-part series.
Hey, maybe yeah, we should consider that. I think they were all spot on. Like every response, every answer. So thank you so much, very very much for that. We will move on. There are a few more questions. I will bring them to your attention at the appropriate time. But
all right, great.
yes, thank you so much. We appreciate that.
Yes, of course. All right, so going back, so not only is it incredibly hard. Oh, also, wait, side note, I want to preface this entire thing with, it is not teachers' fault. Okay, that when I say that we don't do a good job of teaching women's history, this is not your fault. Between active shooter drills and signs of suicide PDs and collaborative breakout sessions or whatever the latest administrative buzzwords you hear, or they hear, that they're now placing on you to carry with an extra pep in your step because the students need you. There's just so little time. And you want to develop lessons. You want to create opportunities for all children to see themselves in what's being taught. But I know that you lack bandwidth and you lack resources and you lack contact time. And man, for those of you teaching APUSH, I mean, you can barely breathe to get through that content. And so I wanted to say that I'm here for you. I'm with you. I support you. And I hope that what we're providing at the museum makes that a lighter lift for you when you do decide to highlight these individuals. So it's not really in the textbooks and in the classrooms. And we see very few commemorations. In fact, and none of the 44 memorials that are maintained by the National Park Service, think Lincoln Memorial or Thomas Jefferson Memorial, focus on women. And 7% of statues throughout the United States are only dedicated to them as well. One small way that the museum has responded is by partnering with the U.S. Mint last year for a 2-year American Women Quarters program. And so be sure to check your change, because not only were there 5 quarters from last year, but this year's quarters, one that has been released, is the Ida B. Wells Barnett Quarter. In April, we'll be releasing the founder of the Girl Scouts, Juliet Gordon Lowe, Vera Rubin, the individual who discovered dark matter, which the fact that you're able to discover something that you cannot see is absolutely fascinating, though it may rival women's historians' work. Althea Gibson, who was the first Black person to win the U.S. Open and the French Open, I believe. And she was also a professional golfer, as one is. Like, it's not enough that we've broken through in tennis. And Stacey Park Milburn, a disability rights advocate. So make sure to check your change as well as their biography on our site. So when women's history is taught, and I'm implicating myself in this because I was working on my PhD when I taught my first survey classes that I look back to and slightly cringe and maybe want to find the class roster and email all of them and apologize. Again, I digress, but oftentimes when we are able to get to women's history, it's usually presented the relatively monolithic blob of a woman's story. These stories are usually white, upper middle class. They're positioned as kind of a June Cleaver meets Mother Teresa. We're going to save the world and we're going to save all of the other women that don't look like us. They faced some hurdles, but they eventually overcame them, and thank goodness they did. And it's this general march, linear march, not circuitous one bit through history where you don't fully understand the barriers or the hurdles. You've got a few people in your back pocket that you can throw out, maybe Elizabeth Cady Stanton, maybe a Gloria Steinem, definitely a Harriet Tubman and a Rosa Parks, and then we fall somewhat flat. As you can see, going back to the 2017 study, found a predominant focus on white women, followed by African American women that are discussed in the classroom. Again, this is by the emphasis and prevalence of the civil rights movement primarily, and even fewer Native American and even fewer Hispanic women. Asian American women, 0%, not even placed on this chart. And these stories, they lack layers. They lack intersections of identity and experience. The various experiences out of the homogenous white-centric blob that is often taught as women's history. And what happens when you do that is that it lacks intersectionality. And we lose the complexity and the depth of these stories when we do that. And so I'll give you a few stories here and then maybe pause for questions again. And these 4 stories, I'll start on the left. Yuri Kochiyama was a tireless political activist, dedicating her life to contributing social change through her participation in social justice and human rights movements. She was born in California in San Pedro, and her father was hospitalized during the bombing of Pearl Harbor. After that bombing, her father, who was just out of surgery, was arrested and detained in the hospital. Now, he was the only Japanese in that hospital, she recalled, and I quote, "So they hung a sheet around him that said prisoner of war. He died shortly thereafter." Yuri lived in an internment camp in Arkansas for 2 years, and this experience in her father's death made Kochiyama highly aware of governmental abuses. She was a close friend of Malcolm X, worked in the redress and reparations movement for Japanese Americans, and supported political prisoners. Those were some constant threads in her work. But by studying Asian American women like that of Yuri Kochiyama, we come to understand that the 19th Amendment and that narrative that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, this temporal construction of the women's suffrage movement, privileged white women's history, because even though sex was removed as a barrier to voting with the 19th Amendment, Chinese American women and Japanese American women were not considered citizens until 1943 and 1952, respectively. And so this is not a time where all women have the right to vote. But it's only by studying the experiences of women of color that we are able to know this. Pictured second to the left is Harriet Jacobs, a formerly enslaved woman who wrote incidents in the life of a slave girl. Now, as many of you probably have taught the narrative of Frederick Douglass or maybe the post-emancipation narrative of Booker T. Washington, we would assume that the greatest terrors of enslavement were almost exclusively in the realm of physical abuse, exhaustive labor, limited food and resources, the psychological terror that was brought on by overseers and slave breakers. But after reading Harriet Jacobs and her experience, you come to find out what it was like when you were enslaved and you turned 12 or 13 or 14. And how owners and overseers and their sons began paying more attention and demanding physical attention. How she prayed when she was pregnant that she would only have sons so another would not have to be subjected to this type of specific torture. She too, in her writings, exposed the additional responsibility of caring for and looking after her children, one that if you read Douglass, really the only child prominently figured in the narrative is himself in the very beginning of his story. Now, this isn't just about making sure that they are not traded, but keeping them safe and keeping yourself safe, as overseers or owners would oftentimes hold them for ransom in order for the mother to do what they wanted them to do. Pictured second to the right is Matilda Jocelyn Gage. She was a suffragist and a Native American rights advocate. She helped found the National Women's Suffrage Association with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and I think most importantly worked as a writer and editor for their suffrage publications. As an advocate for Native American rights, she criticized the United States government for failing to respect treaties, for the brutal oppression of Native people, and she also wrote admiringly about matriarchal forms of power, highlighting women's political power within the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy. In fact, she oftentimes wrote about the Iroquois women in the suffrage publication, and her articles contributed to the radical ideas about equality for women in the United States. Long before the Seneca Falls Convention, you have these women, these early feminists, who lived next to these tribes in upstate New York. Gage, Stanton, and Mott all had direct dealings with these tribes and would regularly visit. Scholar Sally Roche Wagner wrote in Sisters in Spirit that the suffragists believed women's liberation was possible because they actually knew liberated women, women who possessed rights beyond their wildest imagination. Women could, for example, depose a chief and choose another. They had an equal say in times of war because it was believed that if women created life, that they should be positioned to preserve it as well. They also had control over the tribe's land because they cultivated it. Native women, this is in the 19th century. Native women also had access to divorce, had control over their property, things that these early white feminists did not have. Their husband could not be violent, and women even had equal spiritual power in ceremonies. And so if we really want to think about the suffrage movement and all of the intricate layers, we should talk about the ways in which the Iroquois tribe had inspired what became the mainstream suffrage movement. Not only did the sister of the chief possessed the power of nominating his successor, but women could remove chiefs from office as well. And on the right, one of my favorite individuals to talk about is Maggie Kuhn, a subject of my dissertation, who at 65 was forced into mandatory retirement. Now, there were mandatory retirement laws, and yet when she worked as the head of the Civil Rights Office for the National Presbyterian Church, her male colleagues were not forced into retirement, but she and her friends who were in equal level positions were. And so what they ended up doing was starting what they called the Gray Panthers. And it was the first anti-ageist organization in the United States. And by anti-ageist, we're not simply saying discrimination against the elderly, but discrimination on anyone that possesses a particular chronological age that people attach meaning to, that somehow, 10-year-olds are worthless, 65-year-olds are worthless, the 35-year-old middle class that contributes and produces is revered. And so Kuhn believed that it was important that she used her retirement not to learn how to sew, because that is actually the gift that she received at her retirement party, was a sewing machine, but that you use this time to fight for change, for the betterment for future generations. In fact, she labeled those who went to Florida as, and I quote, irresponsible gypsies, or Arizona for retirement homes, that we need to fight. But one of the things that Kuhn realizes as she is fighting for greater rights for older Americans is that aging is distinctly a feminist issue in many ways. She looked around at the AARP and they weren't advocating for the specific needs of women. The fact that women did not have any sort of financial support if their husbands decided to leave them out of pensions, if they did not have any Social Security coming in, if when no-fault divorces came about, their husband took them to court because they needed no reason to, and yet, as Tish Summers would say, became displaced homemakers without any job experience, without any retirement plan. And so the AARP is not looking out for the needs of women, and the women's movement wasn't looking out for the needs of older Americans. If you think of the timeline of the second wave feminist movement and the accomplishments of the second wave feminist movement, it's by and large beneficial to women in their teens, their 20s, their 30s, and maybe their 40s. It's access to education, it's access to birth control, it's access to no-fault divorces. Again, a 26-year-old may be ecstatic that she is able to divorce her husband because she simply does not want to be married to him anymore. But for a war bride of the 1940s who went under this air quotes contract of I care for the home and you care for me, all of a sudden finds herself at 55 and divorced, and judges saying, well, you want to be treated as equal? Here you go. No alimony for you. That there are very few that are actually advocating for the needs of older women. It's even worse for older women of color. It's simply another barrier. And so Kuhn and Tish Summers would be going to these feminist gatherings, these consciousness raising, and they would joke and lament about the whinings of these 20-somethings, about how men keep looking at them. And they would say, don't worry, one day you'll be entirely invisible and no one will look at you anymore. All right, I'll pause there. If there are any questions, Mike, you think that would be good for the chat, or I can continue to move forward.
Okay, good deal. A question about Maggie Kuhn, actually. The question is it's regarding primary source materials or activities that can be used to introduce students to her work and or the work of the Gray Panthers. Maybe just some of the primary source materials or activities that
Yeah.
can
Ooh.
that teachers can use in their classroom.
You know what? I am going to send this to my supervisor at the museum, and I'm gonna bookmark this exact question because I do think
Good deal.
a lesson plan needs to be created. So I spent the majority of my 20s, sadly, in the Temple University archives, digging these things up and looking at everything from her calendars, which were cats against the nuclear bomb. I mean, this woman was a riot, to journals about her 20-something-year-old male lover, which probably is not appropriate for the classroom. But you can check out the episode on the Side Door podcast with the Smithsonian. That, of course, is a secondary source, but I am certain that I could get something in the works. You could even start by Googling an image of Maggie Kuhn, because one of the things that I find so interesting about her, if you look at this picture of her, she is granny extraordinaire, right? She's got it down. She's got the bifocals or the reading glasses. Her hair is back in a bun. She has these very clearly arthritic fingers, right, to suggest that she is of no concern. And yet she is providing some of the most radical rhetoric that she will share on the Johnny Carson show, that she will share at political conventions. And yet it is the exact same thing that the Black Panther Party, that members of the Black Panther Party would say, or other radical organizations that are suggesting that the United States, the problem with the United States is not that we need to, get some new tires and fill up a tank of gas, that we have a lemon here and we need to uproot the system, that we struggle with Detroit syndrome, and meaning always wanting the latest model. But I'm getting a little bit down a rabbit hole. Her image, her aesthetic was such a privilege because she was able to challenge what a lot of individuals like the Black Panthers were not able to do because they did not look like her. She even named her organization the Gray Panthers because she wanted to juxtapose it to the Black Panthers in saying that we will only attack if we are attacked. The Black Panthers actually developed a partnership with the Gray Panthers that they would escort older Americans when they received their Social Security checks to be cashed, because back in the day, right, needing to walk to the bank and to deposit that check and to make sure that they reached their destination safely. And so Maggie Kuhn regularly spoke of the plights, the various plights of individuals, and was a great supporter and advocate of the Black Panther Party. That's actually the only reason why I found out about the Gray Panthers, was reading about the Black Panthers. But at one point, they had higher membership organization rates than I want to say the NRA, and maybe even the Boy Scouts, but I could be making that up. Fact check that one for me. It's escaping me at the moment. So yes, I am going to take that charge, and I am going to create a lesson plan on ageism and on Maggie Kuhn, and just simply the way in which we look at people based off of, right, if they are male or female, if they are old or young, if they are of a particular race or ethnicity, and how to really break that down and show the human side of this. So that's what I'll say about that.
Good deal. Thank you. And Tracy actually had a comment, and maybe you can weigh in on this. She's a first grade teacher.
Okay.
She says, I'm currently teaching a unit on comparing fables from around the world. Unfortunately, most of these stories always have the women rescued by and then marrying the prince at the end of the story.
Yeah.
Then later in the day, I'm teaching them about different women who made a difference in our world for Women's History Month. Next year, I'm considering skipping the folk tales units altogether. Any recommendations for balance in that, particularly for our teachers who are in the room, who have the primary, student audiences, with the younger, students who may have the fables and the folk tales and
Right.
this idea of the rescued, woman by the prince who lives happily ever after,
Right. I mean, I think Reese Witherspoon also has a thing on this too, right? Where she's reading scripts and she's like, what in the world?" Right. So it's not only fables and proverbs and old stories. I really appreciate you bringing that up because it is, what are the implications of this? And I don't want you to second guess everything that you're doing in the classroom, right? But I appreciate this closer analysis. Now, if you were, someone who taught in middle school or high school, I would say continue to teach those and then give them to your students and have them recreate them in a fashion that they find to be, more appropriate based off of what they know about women in history. But of course, in lower school, in elementary school, it's a little bit more challenging. And so I don't necessarily know if you need to throw out fables entirely, but maybe not have as great of an emphasis on that. Instead, leaning on, as I said before, the actual real stories, right? We don't need to talk about Rosie the Riveter. If we do, let's talk about the specific names of the Rosie the Riveters. Um, I think we underestimate the capacity of elementary age children, what they remember, what they retain, the way in which they're viewed, and the stories that they do or do not hear about themselves. It wasn't until the sixth grade that I had a teacher who explicitly stated, he actually said, shout out to Mr. Dave Potter, how many of you, are interested in becoming cheerleaders, right? And so many raised their hands. And I came from a very small rural town of about 17,000. And he said, well, if you have enough athleticism to be a cheerleader, somebody should be cheering you on. And I had never really thought of it, right, in that way of viewing myself as an athlete. Now, little do I know, he was also the cross-country coach and trying to get more people on his team. But I say all that to say, it is in the curriculum, but it's also in the day-to-day interactions. And so, focus on those trailblazing women from history. And I think also, if you're able to take the time, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, focusing on the barriers as well. Not just on the accomplishments, but the ways in which they challenged and they pushed, because this wasn't something that was won overnight.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And we'll move on now. For those of you who have questions, we'll hold for the end.
Okay.
But again, continue to drop them in the Q&A chat. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I have a little bit. I want to rename this talk like Emily's Beef with Women's History Month, or the way in which we talk about women's history. There are so many firsts, right? We like to talk about the first, but as Emmy Humes states, a first tends to imply sequence, which can be misleading because many firsts remain onlys for such a long time. A first should have a superscript, a subscript number underneath that to indicate how long she remained an only. Marie Curie, for example, right? And only 4 decades. And so what does that mean when women look at themselves and what they are capable of doing? Oftentimes, and often enough, the first woman is less a first and more the exception who proves the rule. That rule being that women do not belong here. Exceptions are paragons, superhumans like Marie Curie, who remained an only for decades. Sometimes the genius required to become the first may end up discouraging others from following close behind. And so if we do share these stories of these absolutely phenomenal women, if we don't also share the challenge and the struggle and the barriers, I think we're putting a lot of pressure on our young female students of like, well, Curie did it. I mean, look at this. Look at all these things she battled. And you just have 2 tests this week. Let's chill out, right? That's not exactly what we want to do. Here is a picture of Curie, and as she should have her head in her hands, is pictured here at the first of the Solvay conferences, which is a preeminent gathering in Belgium that came to define much of 20th century physics and chemistry. And this was the year that she had won her second Nobel Prize. Curie, who discovered radioactivity, was this only woman par excellence. She discovered radioactivity. She was the first woman to get a PhD in France. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. She was the first person to win 2 Nobel Prizes. And men were okay with this because, again, she was the exception to the rule that women shouldn't be there. She was just considered odd. She was refused the professorship at the Sorbonne. She was refused to the membership of the all-male French Academy of Sciences. They voted not to admit her. And it was still all-male in 1951 when that same French Academy did not vote her daughter in, who was also a Nobel Prize winner. And so such repetition forces us to pay more attention to the meaning of firsts. We tend to think of firsts as an opening a door for a stream of followers, but they're are not really all that followable anytime soon. The historian Julie Desjardins, posits this idea of the Curie complex, a paradoxical phenomenon encountered by women in science in the wake of Curie's genius, difficulties, and self-abnegation, that her exceptionalism at once inspires and discourages. While her towering example has encouraged women to enter science, it can also lead them and society at large to uphold the prodigious standards of the first and thus judge themselves inadequate. So, in this way, the great exception version of the only woman can become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. The greater the genius of the trailblazer, the harder it may be for mere mortals to follow. Permission to be average can sometimes be the ultimate privilege. A very quick shout out for the history of Women's History Month. No, it was not President Reagan. No, it wasn't even President Jimmy Carter, though both were supporters of the cause. In 1978, the Sonoma County Commission on the Status of Women organized a week-long celebration of women's contributions to society, to culture, and to history. And the week centered on International Women's Day on March 8th. Soon you see a consortium of women's groups and historians throughout the nation begin to celebrate, to the point that President Jimmy Carter asked Americans to recognize women's heritage during National Women's History Week. And that would eventually become Women's History Month in 1987. And he wrote, "From the first settlers who came to our shores, from the first American Indian families who befriended them, men and women have worked together to build this nation. Too often, the women were unsung, and sometimes their contributions went unnoticed. But the achievements, leadership, courage, strength, and love of the women who build America was vital, as that of the men whose names we know so well." And so now that we know about the great importance of women's history, why women's history matters as an investment in our future potential as a country, 51% of our population knowing their history and developing great worth in recognizing themselves in that history, we really need to do better. For example, we need to overcome the performance of Women's History Month. I would love nothing more than you not having this big shabam celebration this month and then forgetting women's history for the other 11. You get an email from a CEO saying, our pillows are great and we love women. Like, great. Thanks for letting me know that. HR and LinkedIn highlight a few women in their business. Like, they're there. Just like, where's Walda? We found one. We have one. They're around. They work for us. And so we highlight with these half stories, these one-dimensional stories, these victories without really focusing on challenge. Could you imagine if Elizabeth Freeman or RBG were here and saw that our celebration of women's history was simply reading women's history about them, about dead them, doing things of the past, and we sit and we say, wow, and that's pretty cool. I mean, RBG fights so that women have access to credit. And what do? We buy a women's history t-shirt from Southwest. Yes, this is real. I found this the other day. I clicked on it and the link was invalid, so I don't know if they were sold out or not. I'm not saying that you shouldn't buy a shirt, but what I am saying is that if we're only wearing the shirt and only making a post, I prefer that Women's History Month be viewed as a month where we create more women's history, that we inspire more girls and young women to create this history, that we don't have these performative acts of highlighting the boldness, the fearless girl, the bronze statue that immediately went viral for so many to flock to Wall Street to get pictures with. And then the investment firm that commissioned the fearless girl sues the female artist for making a few replicas for others. Now, of course, this is trade infringement, etc. And I beg you to acknowledge the slight irony in this. Fearless girl sends powerful message, but also make sure that you do not benefit from this. And so I ask that you talk about women, you talk about the various layers of their experience. You do not have these empty celebrations or a Super Bowl ad that highlights women in sports when just a few years before, mother athletes on full-time contracts received no paid maternity leave or any pay until they got their bodies back and could compete again. We get very excited about the slogans by the inspirational quotes with Seven Nation Army songs playing in the background. But I'd like you to put your money and your time towards exposing women to the challenges and the barriers that those before faced and some of the ones that they still face today. And this doesn't need to be necessarily an opinion thing, a political thing. By stating facts of we are 106 years away from achieving gender parity, or that there is an investment gap, a wealth gap, a pay gap in our country, or that there is a glass ceiling, or that there is this imposter syndrome, that is stating simple fact. And so let's acknowledge some of the barriers, because if you don't talk about them, you're not acknowledging them, and you're suggesting that it is just as easy for, say, Joanne Morgan, who's pictured on the left, she was 28 years old, a space engineer, and the only woman in the Kennedy Space Center's firing room among nearly 500 men when Apollo 11 took off for its trip to the moon. You can almost make her out in the third row. It's very, very small picture, I know. But her inclusion in the room for liftoff was an issue. Taking this picture was an issue. It was assumed that by having a woman included, that it somehow lessened the severity, the significance, the gravitas of the event. Her father gave her a chemistry set when she was little. And he didn't mind that she blew up the patio. Literally, she blew up the patio. And she experienced significant hardship in her first years at the Kennedy Space Center, some that I do not have time to talk about at length in this moment. RBG couldn't even use certain libraries at Harvard Law School because they were not open to women. And it wasn't until she became the second Supreme Court Justice that there was even a bathroom for Sandra Day O'Connor in their chambers. I don't understand. Like, was this woman going through an underground tunnel to find a bathroom to get into the lobby to avoid the crowd? I mean, to me, these things were not built for them. There were legitimate barriers from women being able to have equal access. RBG graduated from Harvard Law School and could not get a position at a law firm in NYC and needed to work for the government instead. Remember, during these women's lifetimes, women could not wear pants without judgment. They could not have a credit card without a man's approval until the 70s. The greatest source of scholarship money in the 70s was the Miss America beauty pageant, and most women were barred from some of the most prestigious schools in the United States. Vera Rubin, the third one listed here, who discovered dark matter. When she was the first astrophysicist, first one to major in astronomy, graduating from Vassar, and could not go to Princeton because they did not admit women, and ended up going to Cornell. And when she got one of her first big positions at the Palomar Observatory, there were not women's restrooms. And so she actually made these paper skirts and glued or taped them onto the doors just so she's like, I am here. Ruby Bridges, at the age of 6, advanced the cause of the civil rights movement. But when she did so, by integrating in elementary school, she was escorted by 4 federal marshals to school every day that year. She walked past crowds screaming vicious slurs at her. Segregationists pulled their white children from the school, and many of the teachers refused to teach her. Barbara Henry, a white Boston native, was the only teacher who was willing to accept Ruby all year, and she was a class of 1. She ate lunch alone and sometimes played with her teacher at recess because no one else would play with her, and she did not miss a day of school that year. And so when we do talk about these girls and women to our girls and our young women, I would rather you provide depth than breadth. As one of my mentors used to say to me, Emily, you can either be comprehensive or you can be true. And so during Women's History Month, I ask you that you remain true by sharing a full story, and some calls to action here, by sharing those barriers and the challenges. And if your students are interested, they will likely do research on their own to see if, when many of do, still exist. I encourage you to take women's history outside of the lesson plan, to be a student yourself and to learn about some of these individuals. And when you see strengths in your own female and male students, say how it reminds you of someone that you had been reading about from women's history. Maybe it's the courage of a Ruby Bridges, the perseverance of a Vera Rubin, the staunch, stubborn attitude of RBG, any of those. It does not need to be an entire lesson plan. It can simply be a sentence. Again, I still remember myself questioning, should I be a cheerleader or should I compete in athletics? There wasn't competitive cheerleading at the time, so I'm acknowledging that that is also a sport. I want you to continue the timeline, to acknowledge that the work has not been done, that we should go back to the Althea Gibson, to this amazing, triumphant Black athlete who walked into predominantly white spaces and proved her prowess on the court. That Althea was there before Serena, and there will be others that will follow. I encourage you also, you cannot see all that clearly in the second column, but you should book a trip, a virtual field trip through the National Women's History Museum. We provide free virtual field trips to K through 12 teachers. These are primarily focused for 5th through 12th grade, but we are looking for elementary teachers to partner with us to create lesson plans. In fact, in April, we are opening applications for teachers to apply to become part of our summer cohort. More about that in a moment. And Mike, I am wrapping up. To locate resources, whether that be on our site, the New York Historical Society, the archives, among many others. We are regularly creating resource lists that I would love to help you with, to develop their mindset. that when individuals say, oh, I can't do that, or I can't do this, you can't do this yet. If you feel like an imposter, of course you are. It's your first day on the job. It's your first day on the team. It's your first day on your academic competition team or the robotics competition. Don't allow them to create narratives that they are somehow less than because they feel a little insecure. And create a project or even a page. One of my favorite things that I did that I would encourage you to do is an in-depth study of Shirley Chisholm at the all-girls school that I was at, and her famous phrase, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And we gave every single one of our students, 400 plus, a folding chair. Don't ask how I had to acquire all of those over the weeks. And we asked them to design these chairs to represent what they will stand for when they have a seat at the table. And so if you go to the National Women's History Museum, you will see that there are virtual field trips. The For Educators by Educators cohort application process begins April 1st, and we will partner with you to create lesson plans that not only help bring more women's history into the classroom, but that also provide a more robust curriculum resource guide for teachers on our website. Introduce lesson plans that we have on our website. We also have virtual exhibits that you can do, and we have a biography compendium of 270 plus women from American history. And so I ask you, as Abigail Adams did her husband John, that in the month of March and year round, that you remember the ladies and encourage young women around you. Help them to discover their history, which will inspire their potential. And please, again, don't simply do this in March, but do it year round. Thank you again, and I'd love to honor any questions if there is time, Mike.
Thank you so very much. What a start to this month. We appreciate you. Your talk was equally illuminating and inspiring. We just again appreciate you taking time out, engaging with our teachers. I'll encourage all the teachers who are here. Please come back and revisit this webinar because there's so very much there. Spend time with it. Encourage your friends to check it out as well. And I see you all in the chat right now. You know, there was a question, Emily, that came up earlier, and this might be a difficult question to ask you, but okay. This is from Ashley earlier on. She said, who is the woman you learned about that you want us to know more about that was not included in your slide deck, included in your slides? Difficult question, but if you want to take a stab at it. Who stands out? Who is not included?
I mean, you know, this is the question, right? You know, this is, and to be quite honest with you, I don't have one.
Yeah.
And it's such a lame response. I know it is such a lame response.
Oh,
it's
good.
like, you know, when students ask how many pages, like just answer the question, as we like to say. But I think so many of our biographies on the museum site, I'm thinking, you know, I didn't say much about Shirley Chisholm, but she started as an educator, right? She started as a teacher, and her activism was inspired so much by what she saw on a day-to-day basis, right? And she took that and was able to not only, I can't imagine having that level of confidence in yourself to put yourself out there at a time when it wasn't even considered normal or regular for women to be in Congress, much less a Black woman, and to be someone who puts herself out there to run for president, unbought and unbossed. I don't know if this is the woman that I want you to know the most about, but this is the woman that I wish would forever be in my corner, that I would love to text with questions. And like when I have those life moments that I need someone, like I just see her as being the ultimate hype woman of potential. And though there were so many barriers, I mean, she was just so inspiring. Yeah. So
Oh,
I'm
man,
a big fangirl of Congresswoman Chisholm.
we appreciate that so very much. And uh, Chisholm, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair.
Bring us. And the other thing that I'll say, I think if she were here today, what I would update,
Yes.
I think what she would say now is, if they don't give you a seat at the table, build your own. And so
Mm.
I think part of women's history, we're at a place in our history where we can equip young women to have the skills to build their own. So often, I think young women form and mold and morph themselves into being what we believe other people want us to be, right? For that approval. And instead, like, somebody doesn't want you there, like, they clearly don't see your worth and they're not of worth. So build your own table, right? I think is what she'd say. But I don't want to put words in her mouth. I don't want to get a haunting of
Understood. Well, uh, thank you again. Thank you. We're a little over time now, but this was everything, and I so appreciate it again to kick off this month for our educators who are in the room who are considering resources. Please follow the work of the National Women's History Museum. And continue to stay up to date on all that's happening there, as well as the programming. I dropped the link earlier to the For Educators, I believe, For Educators by Educators link. So if you get an opportunity, please check that out. Emily dropped a link in the chat for you just now. So please check that out. And again, continue to follow us. All that's happening at the nationalhumanities.center.org, on our various social media channels as well, and support the humanities. We provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and the tools that they and their students need to make a difference. Next up, we have Bob Dylan Center, Living Artists and Legacy Archives. Stephen Jenkins, who's the director of the Bob Dylan Center, will be here on March 11th at 7 o'clock p.m. Again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your patience, your understanding, and your overall energy and passion for this work. And so I wish you all well. I hope you all have a relaxing and restorative weekend. If I can assist with anything, again, please do not hesitate to reach out. Again, take care and be well, my friends.